My name is J.D. Talasic. I'm the Director of Cultural Programs of the National Academy of Sciences. And as you all know, the screening of the film, The Plastic Problem, was originally scheduled at the National Academy of Sciences building as part of the DC Environmental Film Festival. So we are grateful to all of you and our panelists and our technicians that we are able to gather here online and continue these important discussions with some level of normality. The film screening is organized by two offices of the National Academy of Sciences, Lab X and Cultural Programs. It is part of a series of events that we call the Eternal Experience. And the focal point for this series is Eternal, a 60-foot long jellyfish sculpture constructed out of plastic bags by scientist and artist Maris Polanco. Like many institutions, the NAS building is currently closed, but we hope to be able to welcome you back soon so that we can share this really wonderful sculpture with you. So the sculpture, like the film that will be discussed today, points towards the issue of plastic in the ocean and the dangers it presents for ocean wildlife and our ecosystem. If by chance you have not yet seen the film, you can stream it online after the discussion at your leisure. You can find links on either the cpnas.org website or labx.org. At any time during the discussion, you can send questions to the panelists via the Q&A box on your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn this over to our moderator, Taylor Maddalene. Taylor serves as the director of the Source to See Plastics Initiative at National Geographic. Her role includes developing, managing, and executing the recent international Source to Sea expeditions. Her background is in marine conservation and the integration of science into decision making. Taylor, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, JD, for the introduction, and thank you to our growing, it looks like almost 100 attendees and growing that are taking the time to join us, and we appreciate everyone for continuing on with this panel. We're excited to have the conversation today, and thank you to everyone at the Academy and at PBS and the district for helping to pull this together, and to my panelists today who I'm excited to chat with. So first off, I want to introduce our panelists. So we've got three fantastic plastic champions that are joining us here today, starting with Amna Nawaz, who is with PBS NewsHour. Hopefully you'll all recognize Amna, as she is a journalist reporting in the plastic problem. She joined PBS NewsHour in 2018, and she serves as the senior national correspondent and primary substitute anchor there. We also have with us today Lorna Baldwin, who is also with PBS NewsHour. Lorna is a general assignment producer for PBS NewsHour, and she was responsible for producing The Plastic Problem for PBS. And then finally, we have Lillian Power from the Department of Energy and Environment here in DC. The Watershed Protection Division's enforcement team, which is led by Lillian Power, is responsible for implementing and enforcing policies regulating single-use plastic in the district. So this includes things such as the styrofoam ban, recyclable and compostable food services, and requirements, and also including the single-use plastic straw and stirrer ban and the 5-cent bag fee, which is the first of its kind for our nation. So lots of pioneers here on the panel today. So thank you for joining us. I want to start by asking some questions about the documentary itself, and I hope that everyone was able to view it beforehand and enjoyed it. I know I certainly did. So I'd actually like to start with Lorna, if we can. Lorna, could you just tell us a bit more about how this project got started from its inception, and from a personal standpoint, what you were really excited to tackle in this project?
Sure. Thanks, Taylor. Yeah, this actually started as part of a series that we did for the PBS NewsHour, and it started in the series itself didn't really get started production until April of 2018, but the idea for it came from a totally separate shoot that I was on in Costa Rica in December of 2017. So has kind of a long trajectory, as a lot of things in television do. But the story in Costa Rica that spurred my interest in this whole idea of plastic was ironically about a research project that was happening in Costa Rica as a way of saving sea turtles. And the ironic part of it is that the way they were trying to save these, it's actually sea turtle eggs, which in Costa Rica are consumed as a delicacy. And so a lot of wildlife biologists are trying to stop that practice by using a plastic 3D printed fake egg that they put a GPS tracker into and drop into the nests of the sea turtles, in the hopes that they can sort of track the where the poacher then would take those eggs and sort of keep track of where they're going, and then target those areas for educational outreach to stop that practice, or at least reduce that practice. And it's been working pretty well for them. So we were reporting on that story, and it was there that I met the wildlife biologist that you see in the documentary, Helen Feasy, the English woman who is one of the people working on that project. And she sort of just, we were on these incredibly beautiful, very remote beaches, and she would sort of reach down into the sand and pick up single-use plastic and say, look at this, this is killing the animals that we're here trying to protect. And so she really got me interested in looking at this product, or this material that we sort of take for granted in our everyday lives, and what harm it may be doing, and how we got to that stage. So then that led to pitching it as a series for the PBS NewsHour, and then that in turn led to the documentary that you all watched, hopefully. So that's my long answer.
That's perfect. That's excellent. So building on that, Amna, I'd love to just hear more about sort of the learning process and journey that you went through in making this documentary, and also how that's translated into changes that you might be making in your own life coming out of this.
Yeah, I should conference in my husband, I think, because he can tell you about the many ways in which I've been implementing all of those changes into our lives, much to his sometimes. I will say, first of all, thank you to all of you for being here, and to the NAS for hosting this. And we're so excited there's still so much interest in this topic, because despite all the other headlines, this is something that we are still going to be dealing with for a very long time. And because she won't say it herself, I have to take a moment to give enormous kudos to Lorna Baldwin, without whom none of this would have been possible. I mean, that idea that she started with, that was the one idea that then led to months and months and months of work that I wonder if sometimes Lorna regretted pitching in the first place, because it ended up being so much work. But it was such a necessary story for all of us to tell, because I think, unless you are focused on the environment as a journalist, and focused on energy or climate change or all the many kind of topics that intersect here, it's sort of the thing that's floating in the ether, it's around you, but you don't really get how bad it is until you start to dig into it. And that was the premise we started with, which was, well, just how bad is this problem? Which is kind of a basic question to start with, but you'd be shocked how many people don't really get it. And, when Lorna is saying we should pitch it, we should put it together in this way with this series, and kind of feature it and rolling out these questions, I think it set out to kind of answer a lot of the basic questions that people didn't even know they had. Because as everyone said, look, plastic is such an embedded and institutionalized part of our lives. You don't go through almost a single activity of your day anymore without touching it or interacting with it or depending on it in some way. And it becomes hard to see it as a problem unless you really open your eyes up to what's happening in the rest of the world and understand it's happening on your back door. It's happening on your shorelines as well. So for me, I took all the lessons we learned along the way, and I've been slowly implementing them into my life. My task was to kind of deplastic my house, to start with that. And there's a ton of basic things we go through with, like, these are the many recyclable things you can use. These are the reusable things you can use. And those are all simple things a lot of people already do. I set out to do it room by room, because we met families along the way who were doing exactly that. We said, start in the bathroom, try to cut out all the plastic. And you would be amazed how difficult it is when you really get down to identifying every piece of plastic in your life and saying, now, how can I replace that with something that's reusable or non-plastic? So it's still very much a work in progress.
I completely sympathize with that. And that sounds like it's been an incredible journey. I mean, everyone has to start somewhere. So just one more quick question coming from the documentary, and then there's a couple other kind of solution-focused conversations I'd love to have. But Lorna and Amna, one of the things I really appreciated about the documentary is all of the characters. I mean, you all reached out to such a wealth of scientists and practitioners and you know, people that deal with this problem every day and people that are thinking about it every day and that are looking at it from very different perspectives. I would love to just quickly hear if there was one person or one solution that you encountered along the way that really stuck with you, that you still think about every day.
What do you think, Lorna?
That's you know, to pick one is really tough, but there was, you know, I was sort of thinking back on all of the folks that we met. There is one story that, you know, there's so much that gets left out and left on the cutting room floor, but the story that we heard from, he's actually, I think he's towards the end of the documentary, Toby McCartney, who was the man who runs a company that is trying to use plastic to make roads. And one of the interesting things, I think what fascinated me most about a lot of the people we talked to was how they came to their ideas and how they landed on these ideas. And his was, he lives in Scotland, but he had been traveling in India and he noticed how people were, and this is not environmentally friendly at all, but how people were filling potholes there. They would take a bunch of plastic bags, stuff them into the pothole, and then light them on fire, and that would melt the plastic and fill in the pothole. And he got to thinking, well, we have all this plastic that we aren't using. How could I do something like that in roads? And it's, again, I mean, this is not an example of somebody who's not using plastic, but he is, you know, finding ways to use the plastic that we already have. And I just thought that that was really an interesting way that he landed upon this idea. And I think, you know, there were other people we talked to who, the way they came upon their ideas were just fascinating. Like the student in Oregon, Morgan Vague, she, you know, she just had this hypothesis that she grew up in Galveston, Texas, and she thought, I bet you there's a lot of, you know, petrochemical activity in the soil around here. What if I just try and get these soil samples and then run tests on it and see if there happen to be bacteria inside it that have already figured out ways to consume plastic. And, you know, that was another really just interesting way that somebody came upon this idea. And I think that's so much of what the plastic problem is all about, is hunting for solutions. I don't know if you've got a favorite.
I think you and I talked about this too. Morgan Vague was one of our favorites to meet along the way because she was such a talent and so sharp, and you just saw that this was someone who was using all of her expertise and experience and thinking, okay, you know, how am I going to make a difference in the world with what I do here? So I remember being really fond of her and really fascinated with this idea that she woke up and said, what if we did things this way? I think the two other conversations that stuck with me though, one was really the conversation with the executive from Unilever, because I think it made very real for us, for all our conversations about, you know, the moral imperative and the climate imperative. There are very real economic imperatives that are pushing back in a lot of ways against a lot of these best efforts. And I think it sort of made whole for me this idea that it's not going to work with just one side advocating and fighting for these changes. It has to work for the entire system. You have to make the change happen on the producing side as well, by whatever means, for it to really make a difference. But the thing I think that really struck with me was the little girl in the family that we met, who were, the mom's working really hard to get plastic out of their lives. You know, she's talking to everybody, even to grandparents, and being like, please don't bring plastic presents, like please don't bring things wrapped in plastic into the house. It's a struggle. And the little girl, because she's been raised in this way, she sees her mom shopping at the zero waste market. She sees her mom making an effort to use reusable packaging and not bring plastic into the house. She has conversations with her about, you know, the damage to the environment. And I think that really hit home for me, that this kind of social change also has to be kind of a generational change. For it to land and evolve in the way that makes an impact, it's going to mean teaching an entire generation of kids this is what it's going to take. Because I remember growing up and thinking, well, we're recycling, so we're fixing it. We're doing everything we have to do. And that wasn't an idea I really lost until I was an adult and realized, oh, we're not fixing it. And I think that for me kind of hit home that this is something that's going to have to last an entire generation for it to really change and last.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Amna, and I think that's a really important message, and just I think it's fantastic the way that you all captured all of the different sort of innovations and points on this issue, because it's certainly not a silver bullet problem. It's extremely multi-pronged, and it takes a lot of different dimensions at one time to really get to the core of it. And that actually tees us up nicely to my next question, which was to Lillian, who is at the front lines of this issue, right in our backyard here in DC. And so I wanted to ask you, Lillian, we hear a lot about how partnerships and collaboration across sectors is really critical to address solutions on this issue. And I wanted to talk a little bit about responsibility, because I know there's been some recent legislation around extended producer responsibility and recycling legislation in the US. And I wanted to just hear more about your experience with legislation, especially across sectors, and how it's supported your work, and if you feel that these developments are moving in the right direction and in a positive direction, and how it's affecting your work.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Taylor, for that question. Here in the district, I would say legislation has actually been a really effective method in controlling and reducing single-use plastics as a source of pollution in our waterways and litter in our communities. Not only that, in like targeting particular issues, like particular single-use plastics, but it also has been really, really important for generating awareness around these issues and these items, and also just like really pushing behavior change, right, which are all really core key components to addressing this issue over the long run. In DC, we have several laws around single-use plastic regulation. We have, as you mentioned, our 5-cent bag fee. So every business that distributes disposable plastic or paper bags must charge 5 cents for every bag distributed. We also have a foam ban, a foam food serviceware ban, and a single-use plastic straw and stirrer ban, which is just over a year old. That's brand new here in the city. And I think the 5-cent bag fee is a really great example of how legislation really enacts this long-term change. It's over 10 years old here in DC, and really what we've seen is we've done surveys of residents, and we found that over 80% of residents surveyed report using fewer single-use plastic bags now that they're aware of the issue, now that they're being charged a nickel for every bag distributed. We're also seeing our nonprofits that work on organizing cleanups. We see over an 80% reduction in the amount of plastic bags at their cleanup events in the district. We're also generating over $2 million in revenue every year, specifically from the bag fee, for projects aimed at restoring and protecting our waterways. So that's stream restorations, that's green infrastructure installations, that's a lot of outreach and education, which is what Amna just sort of suggested, right? Is like, we really need a generational approach to this, right? So educating the next generation about these issues, about the connection between watersheds and waterways, and how these plastics can really impact human health, water, and aquatic wildlife, that kind of thing is really, really important. So we've seen really, really positive benefits, and the same can be said for our foam ban and our plastic straw ban. We're seeing fewer of these items in our waterways, in our communities, so they're having that lasting impact. When it comes to like EPR, so extended producer responsibility legislation, we do see that that's becoming a hotter topic here in the US. It's been around globally for a very long time. In many other countries, like over 3 decades, I think like EPR legislation's been the common the normal thing in Europe and other locations. And yeah, I think the key here is that there are so many different facets to this issue, and so many locations in the waste stream or in the total plastic loop, right, that we can target in terms of legislation. And I think EPR is a really interesting, a way of doing that. And really, there's just not just one right way to tackle this issue. We need a lot of different creative ways in terms of not just legislation, but behavior change as a culture to change and, help address the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. A piece for sure, but definitely a piece of a much larger puzzle.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear from Amna and Lorna. Just, I know this documentary has been a while in the making. It's been an incredible journey, and the conversation and developments around plastics and solutions in general, I feel like is such a rapidly changing one. How have you all noticed that the landscape around either plastics, solutions, legislation, the conversation around single-use plastics, how has that changed just in the time since you started working on this documentary?
I do remember one of our challenges as we were putting it together, because it did take so many months to report and put together. We had a graph in there that was trying to capture how many different pieces of legislation there actually were in the United States at the state level or the county level or city level that addressed some kind of plastic ban. And there are also, we should point out, the states where they say you cannot pass any legislation that bans any kind of plastic, like that. Those kinds of legislation exist too. And so we were trying to get our arms around it. We have these wonderful researchers working with us. And I remember, and Lorna, correct me if I'm wrong, even up until the last days of like trying to get tracking in and final information in and fact checks, it was like, no, wait, there was just this one rule that came out in this one city. And wait, that one rule that we've followed up on before has changed since then. And so we could see that there was a lot of activity around it. I remember we had to kind of couch very carefully how we were presenting numerically what was going on. But certainly the pace of things, I think, seems to have picked up. And that was reflected in the conversations we had with the executives, with both the Unilever and the Coca-Cola executive, because you realize they are watching what's going on in the market. And the market is the people. And there is a conversation and there is pressure increasingly building, not only upon local legislative bodies, but also upon the producers and the people who depend on those consumers to keep them in business, to try to act in some way. So I think what you've seen, especially with the level of sort of responsiveness and willingness to act in some way, maybe not as much as a lot of people would like, but on the part of the producers, when you see that willingness, I think that speaks to the fact that there's a lot of activity happening at the grassroots level right now. And in states where there are legislatures that are amenable to it, you're seeing real action in response to that.
Yeah, I would just add too, when I sort of came up with the idea or started paying attention to it myself, I have a lot of family who live in Britain. And I think one of the things that I was seeing on a lot of the social media that I was reading from there was in response to the Blue Planet series that was done. And that sort of started to shift things in Britain. And then I think you started to see here in the US more of a focus on it, especially when National Geographic put it on their cover. And I think that was in April of 2018, in the April issue, and such an iconic cover as well. And really the focus, the sustained focus that National Geographic decided it was going to put on this subject as well. So I think, it's a combination of things. I think it is that the media started paying more attention to it. It's, as Amna just mentioned, corporations started realizing we have consumers who don't want us to do this, and started hearing it from people and are starting to look at their own sort of supply chains and how they can make changes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And you are absolutely right. It was a June 2018 for the magazine that came out, but we've been, it's incredible the traction that even just the image from our cover has had. It's something that the team here has been really proud of and really excited about. And it just seems like that conversation is just completely taken off, which is really, really exciting to see. So Lillian, I just wanted to bring it back to our backyard again. So we're actually already getting a lot of questions about this as well, but in terms of things like bans and, taxes and fees, and that sort of way of addressing the problem. I just wanted to talk about that a little bit because I also understand that you have been officially dubbed by The Daily Show as the straw cop.
Yes.
And I thought that was a fantastic segment. If anyone hasn't seen that, I would definitely recommend looking it up. There's been, it was brought up in the documentary in terms of the challenges around this, and we've already had some questions that are coming in from people specifically around sort of how that translates to reactions from small businesses and communities, and especially, potentially a burden on lower income communities. But I would love to just hear from you sort of what your experience has been in terms of the reaction from your community and implementing some of these things, and what is that looking like on the ground and how it's gone?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think it is a fairly common concern around surrounding legislation of this kind across the US in particular, as you mentioned, how this could potentially disproportionately affect small business owners or lower income communities. And what I will say, particularly from our experience with the foam ban and all three, the straw ban and the 5-cent bag fee, is that, people and businesses are extremely adaptable as long as your approach to the transition is fair and is built on, a clear education and outreach approach, right? We always make sure to give our businesses ample time, and we provide very clear messaging about, exactly when does the transition need to be in effect, what exactly can you use now, that kind of thing. And we also, for every law, more recently with the straw ban and the straw ban and the foam ban in particular, when preparing the community, we actually go door to door to these businesses and visit hundreds of businesses and give them the opportunity to provide feedback, to ask questions, and that helps us better inform where the weaknesses in communication may be, what we need to be clearer about, what are their concerns and how can we help to address, right? We don't want to really come in as the enforcers. We would prefer to come in as the regulators that are there to assist with the transition, and it's been extremely successful. All three of these bans, while there was originally this concern that alternative products are more expensive, that the fee might be too much of a burden for lower income communities, we have not heard any complaints about any of these issues since they've been put into effect. In particular, with the 5-cent bag fee, we distribute tens of thousands of reusable bags with a focus on senior citizens and low-income communities every year. So we also want to put in their hands the alternative that they can use, right, that will support them in the way that they need when they go grocery shopping, when they need those bags. So I will say, I've heard that question many times, and I will say here in the district, businesses and residents are very adaptable and they are resilient, right? These changes are the new normal. When it comes to straws, there was a lot of focus, I think, like beyond the district when we actually put the ban into effect. People were shocked that we enforce them, and we actually go out and inspect businesses and check and see if they're actually using compostable or reusable straws, right? And there was a lot of pushback about, well, why are you putting all this energy into plastic straws? Like, why does it even matter? It's not that big of a deal, right? It's such a small part of the problem. And I will just say here, like a small part of the problem is still a part of the problem. There is nothing wrong with chipping away at the issue one item at a time, and straws are so great for that, because I think the term many people in the industry use is it's a gateway plastic. So many people interact with it, a plastic straw, in their daily life, right? So many people without even really taking notice of it, right? It's a perfect introduction into starting to understand how many single-use plastics we really use in our day-to-day lives, and how many of them we don't necessarily need, right? Like the vast majority of the time, for the vast majority of people, a straw is not necessary, period, right? Plastic straw or no. So we really saw, like with the ban here, it was actually mostly motivated by our residents, by our businesses. They actually really wanted to see this change. And it was a really great opportunity for our mayor and our government's kind of like environmental goals, just really naturally aligning with the wants and needs of the community. And it all came together to pass this rule, right? Which we consider a really great success. And we absolutely see it having the intended effect that we had hoped, right? We do go in and inspect those businesses. We've seen a sharp decrease in the number of plastic straws that are being served. It's the new normal. And again, people have adapted, and it's just not even something they necessarily think too much about, although we are seeing the next phase, I think, in the change, and we see a lot of businesses training their servers to ask if people want a straw first, right? We see a lot of customers going into businesses and saying no straw please, right? Like that kind of thing, even though that's not really what we've regulated. The legislation for some was that first step in recognizing the issue, and then now they're taking it a step beyond, which is, I think, really, really great. And hopefully I would not be surprised if that was the first step in them, really addressing many other plastic items in their lives.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I thought that was a great point that you made in your in a section in the Daily Show and that's a phrase that I've come to use too. Is it's the gateway plastic, and it's something that yeah, absolutely, and it's something that we think about a lot at National Geographic as well through our consumer campaigns, and also when we're out on expedition in communities. Is you have to meet people where they are. It's about getting people into a pipeline and seeing it as representative, because once you start seeing it, you really can't stop. As you were saying earlier, Amna, it's something that's you start seeing it, and then you notice it everywhere, and you just have to start somewhere. So that's excellent. So I just have a couple more questions, and then we can get into some questions for the audience, because we're already getting some fantastic questions in here, which is great. So please, if everyone continue to submit questions through the Q&A on Zoom, we'll try to get to as many as we can. And I've noticed that some of the questions are on recycling, and this was something that I wanted to sort of ask all of you in different capacities, because I know this is something the documentary touched on as well, particularly in the US, with China no longer accepting our recycled items, and realizing sort of some of the shortcomings that our domestic recycling programs are having, and some of the legislation that's going into place to hopefully bolster that. It seems like there's some perception among communities, especially domestically, that there's not necessarily a value to recycling or an importance to it, because people are starting to realize that it might not get recycled. And they're sort of questioning the benefit of that stream. It looks like some audience members have also been asking about just the value of recycled content. If there's a purpose for that post-consumer recycled content, and a value for it and a chain for it. So I just wanted to ask what this group's experience has been with that narrative and with the recycling stream, and what you would tell people, especially in the US, that are sort of questioning that right now. And you can whoever would like to start is welcome to.
I'm happy to. Oh, sorry, Amna, you please go first. Okay, great. So just really quickly before you want to share, basically, so it's understood. I know that the sort of green wall, right, this change in China's policy has generated a lot of public interest, and there's been a lot of news stories around this. That being said, I would say from DC's perspective, right, China no longer accepting much of our recyclables is really like a short-term issue that we're working on right now, but that it's really a great opportunity for the U.S. to develop its own recycling infrastructure locally, right? Which in the long run is actually better for the environment. We're not shipping things all the way to China, right? And it's actually better for the U.S. economy, right? Like recycling generates jobs. Recycling reduces greenhouse gas emissions locally, right? These are all very good things that will be dealt with, right? The investment in increased recycling, manufacturing capability, it's starting to happen here in the US. Like it's definitely, in transition, but we're working on it. And it'll take a few years before I think your local resident will really see that change and that effect. But that's because these kinds of infrastructure changes really take time, right? So I would say from DC to any district residents out there, right, and just everybody beyond the district, please do keep recycling, right? Like keep that habit going. That behavior is really, really important, and it's not for nothing. We're in a transition phase, but you know, we're actually moving to a better place than where we were when we were still just depending on China and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and I also say I so appreciate Lillian making that pitch right out the gate, because from the consumer perspective, which is kind of from where we approach this project, right, and sort of the mass perception starting point, I get why people are frustrated. You know, our recycling, especially here in the United States, has never been easy. And there was a time when it was kind of easy, and then there was a time when it was super complicated and everyone didn't know which bin to put what things into, and then we moved largely to single stream. But even in that, it really depends on where you live in this country, what you can and can't recycle. And I think people either fall on one side of the issue or the other, which is like, why am I even bothering? Because I don't even know what goes in here and I might mess it up if I throw something wrong. Or they think, well, I'm really going to do everything I can, and they throw everything they can into the bin, and then that will mess it up too because the rules are so strict. I mean, I'll just say I'm a Virginia resident, and our rules have changed twice in the last 2 years we've lived here. And unless you are really keeping up on it, because the outreach and education aren't as robust as they can be, unless it's really important to you and you're keeping up on it, you're not necessarily doing it right. So going back to the lessons learned from this project, you know, there's one business voice we talked to who was with this business called Taco Time, and they had moved to it was a regional business out in the Pacific Northwest. They had moved to fully compostable serving utensils, platters, everything. So basically, consumers didn't have to think about it. It was like, oh, you get your food, basically eat what you want, and then when you're done, everything goes into one bin. And the lesson I took away from that, which is super simple, but it's also something I think a lesson for all of us when we're advocating for change and kind of looking at what works and what doesn't, is that the easier you make it for people, the more likely they are to participate, the more likely it is to work. And right now, the system that we have is not easy.
Yeah, I would just add too, you know, one of the things we heard reporting all aspects of this story that led back to recycling was, you know, national systems have value. And in the US, with the lack of a national recycling program or any kind of, you know, labeling of goods, that is a big part of the problem. And there was legislation just introduced in February in Congress that I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but it is the first legislation that actually looks at that and sort of recommends not only a sort of more nationalized recycling plan, but also looking at sort of corporate responsibility in the things that they're producing and putting it on the producer side of things, much like what we saw happening in Canada with their announcement last year. So yeah, that is definitely another piece of the problem.
Thanks, everyone. That's really interesting to hear. And just one final thing for everyone that can maybe even be somewhat rapid fire before we get to some of the audience questions. But I'd love to know, for people that are watching this documentary, what is the one thing that you would like an audience member to come away with for them to integrate into their own life? And we can go backward. Let's start with Lorna and then Amna and Lillian.
I think for me, what I would hope you would take away is that even small changes matter. You know, don't think that just because you're changing one tiny bit of your life, that's not making an impact. It will.
Yeah, Lorna took mine, but it's the same thing Lillian said earlier, which is that just because it's a small part of the problem doesn't mean it's not part of the problem. And you know, one of the final thoughts we have in this doc is that it's going to take everything. It's going to take everyone. It's going to take every single inch of this system working towards the same mission for any kind of change to be made. And I think people need to feel empowered to know that literally every small change you can make, even if it's just switching to a reusable water bottle every day. Like that one small thing can actually have a huge impact. So I would encourage people to find one small thing. And even if you find one thing a week or one thing a month, it's making some kind of a change.
I will say, so absolutely what Lorna and Amna just said. I have my reusable water bottle right here, right? And just using this every day, refilling it instead of, using plastic bottles, you're just as one person, right, eliminating a source of probably thousands of plastic bottles every year, right? It's a very minor change, but it's also actually a very large change. And that also will go up the chain, right, to our businesses to see if there's not as much of a demand for these single-use plastic items, right, they're gonna start evaluating alternatives. I will say, just to add, I work for local government. I would say do not discount the power of local government as well as your federal government. There have been a lot of local legislation throughout the country really working on these single-use plastic issues. So get to know your delegate, right? Like get to know your council members, get to know your government in your county, in your city, in your township, in your state. Lobby them for change, see what bills are being introduced, or let them know what you'd like to see here, right? Culture can change locally, right? It can be small and spread out, right? So, and I think, here in the district, we're always really interested in hearing what our residents are most interested in, right? And what they'd like to see next. So please do go ahead and do some research and make some calls, shoot some emails, and it can make a big difference.
Can I just add one other thing I would say,
Yeah,
which is, we haven't talked too about consumption and just not consuming as much as we consume. We don't necessarily need all the things that we think we need. And so just thinking about how you consume, I think is very important in solving this sort of problem.
I'd like to just hop on that too, is just saying the issue with single-use plastics here, yes, it's plastics, but a lot of it is that single use, right? Like single use is the issue. We can't just assume that the alternative material that's going to replace those traditional plastics are going to have, exponentially better environmental benefits, right? So the best absolute thing we can do is reduce that dependence on the single-use item itself, right? Absolutely. Thank you, Lorna, for that.
thank you, everyone. That was fantastic. And we really appreciate you thinking through some of those solutions. And I'm sure that everyone's going to come away with from this documentary with some really, hopefully some interesting and new perspectives on the issue, and also lots of concrete solutions. So I think that's fantastic. So let's go ahead and get to a couple of the audience questions. So there was a question that came up from a couple of people. It looks like Lelia and Amber and a couple others had asked Amna specifically about the conversation that you had with Unilever and also Coca-Cola, and just asking about sort of the role that corporations and supply chains have to play in this issue. And it looks like people are just curious to hear more about how your conversation with them went, and if you got a sense that they are really anxious to make change and eager to make change, and what sort of changes that looks like are realistic to happen in that world.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they're anxious to make change. I think that they are responsive to the changes that they are being asked to make. And I think that's the important part of this, which is that businesses, any corporation is not going to necessarily act solely on a moral imperative. And we shouldn't expect that of them in any kind of capitalist society, right? But there are very real market forces at play here. And when you talk about the power of the individual action and the power of the individual dollar, when they're hearing en masse from people, I'm no longer going to be buying this product. Maybe I don't even know that much about it. If you think about like every average day, every sort of average level consumer, they'll think, well, I read that this thing is mostly made of recyclable product, and so it's better for me to buy this, and I feel better about buying this, and how we feel is a big part of how we buy. And that means that, more more of that is coming off the shelves for them, that they're responsive to that. They get that there is something happening they need to respond to. At the same time, they have a bottom line to protect. And there were a few moments in our conversations when I really pushed them on a couple of things. Coca-Cola, for example, on, setting a target. When you say we're setting out to try to recapture X amount of the plastic we put out there, and I'll say, okay, well, what is your production goal? Because we can all agree you have to produce less for there to be less waste. Do you have a production goal that you're setting as well? And the answer, despite a lot of our pushing, was that's not part of our targets right now. So they're inching along, but they are not quite there. Related to that, I'll say in the conversation with Unilever, there was a little bit of tension when we went back and forth on the issue of responsibility. Like, where does that burden of responsibility lie? Because especially in Canada, a lot of the conversation right now with the new legislation they introduced was extended producer responsibility, right? Like, you're responsible for what you put out there. You have to figure out how to get it back somehow. But the corporations are obviously saying, look, consumers need to be better about the things that they buy. That, the executive we talked to said, I don't know that I would consider a plastic bag single use, because you can go reuse that bag again and again and again. And we've seen this in the past, when it comes to the issue of littering and it comes to other issues. You see corporations trying to kind of share the blame, because consumers absolutely bear some responsibility to this, but that is where some of the tension is right now. They will act in terms of what is best for their bottom line, and they will act in response to what consumers tell them they want, and that's where the power of the everyday buyer lies.
Yeah, I would just add to what Amna said, being behind the scenes in those interviews that she was doing. I think the one interesting thing, and I believe it's in the documentary, was from our executive at Coca-Cola. She mentioned in particular Generation Z, and that it's that Gen Z category that they are really, really focused on, and that is who they're worried about losing the most, and why I think it's driving some of their decisions. One of the other interesting things that I learned when we were at Coca-Cola is one of the challenges they have, they're a totally global company, and they're operating in all these different countries, and to try to come up with one solution for them just doesn't work. And, they told us that very, very bluntly, but some of the things that they're trying in other countries, like I did not know about. For example, they're in Brazil, they're moving to a refillable market. So you would take your container into the store and just refill it. And I think in Brazil that accounts for, I believe it was somewhere between 20 and 30% of the market right now there. And, I look at that and I think, well, why, when are you going to try that here? When are you going to try that someplace else? And same with, bottle laws. That was another thing, that happens in some states. I grew up in Michigan. It's something that they do in Michigan. Why does it work some places, not others? These are all still questions I have, frankly, but these were interesting things that didn't make it in the documentary, but that, there are other things that they're trying.
No, that's great to hear. It's always fascinating to hear about the interesting things that, as you said, didn't make it into the documentary, but are, really interesting tidbits and really supporting information. So thank you for sharing those. And it's actually perfect that you mentioned that, because one of the first questions that came through, it looks like from Dila, was, are there any international collaborations that you all are aware of to spread change-making business plans across countries? So they mentioned, the grocery stores in Canada and legislation in the US. And have you all encountered any situation where that sort of knowledge exchange on what works and doesn't work in different contexts has happened? And it sounds like that might be something that would be really valuable. I'd love your thoughts on anyone that would like to respond to that one. Or give it some thought. That I'm not aware. I mean, I know there are lots of sort of informal networks that are trying to share knowledge of best practices and, policy playbooks and things like that are coming out. But I'd be interested to know if you came across any that really stood out in your research, or Lillian, if there's any that you encounter in DC in terms of sort of swapping knowledge between different cities in the US or different countries internationally.
I mean, I can speak, so from like our perspective here in DC, I can't think off the top of my head of any like particular like collaborations like internationally. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. I'm just not aware of them at this time. But we absolutely like regionally and nationally reach out to each other, different jurisdictions, to assist each other, right, with what works, with what doesn't work. DC is constantly sharing our enforcement and implementation strategies, right, that and points of success, even in you know, just the initial transition and the long-term success of our programs. I will say that we've heard from industry like regionally that, you know, because DC is abutting, right, like Maryland and Virginia, and within those states there are different counties that all have their different laws. And for some of the laws that I work on, the industry actually prefers consistency, right? They want to see if you're going to have an EPR bill, if you're going to have a bag law bill or something. They want to see partnerships from the regulatory perspective, right? Because it's really hard to keep track of all the minor changes and details. And so for international corporations, I mean, I can't speak for them, but I know that my experience has been that like consistency from the industry perspective has always been really key when they're communicating with us about new potential laws.
I'll just also mention, I mean, that's actually a pretty tough question. But I will mention that there
it's
is
be a little bit wicked. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's okay. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, so they have the New Plastic Economy initiative, which is one of the things that Unilever and Coca-Cola had both signed on to, and it is a global initiative to get corporations to sign on and disclose what their plastic production is, and it's also an effort to reduce their ultimate output. But really, I think it's about transparency too. And so that's one that I came across that sort of crosses boundaries. And I do believe, and I'm racking my brain, and I just did a quick Google search to try to find it too. I know there is a United Nations group that's working on this subject, but I can't find the exact name of it. So.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, I know that I believe the UN's got a couple global partnerships on marine litter, or a global partnership on marine litter with subgroups within that have been working on this at a government level. But that's great to hear, you know, from you all on the forefront what you've encountered and what seems to be working or what doesn't. So that was a great question from the audience. Lillian, just really quickly, there are a couple of very DC specific questions. Someone, let's see, Jane had asked how close DC was getting to getting no waste grocery stores, and if there's any other interesting solutions that are coming down the pipeline.
That's a great question. I am not sure, to be totally honest, because that's very much industry and business led. I have been into many grocery stores here in DC that are thinking through these issues and are minimizing their plastic use, but I to my knowledge, have not been in one that's that zero waste, that zero plastic use, like we saw in the documentary. In terms of innovative solutions and next steps, you know, I think DC is constantly looking for how to progress, right? We see this issue of single-use plastics as, you know, one that will take continued creativity and, you know, efforts to address. So, you know, I would say I am not thinking of anything in particular right now, but we're constantly looking at our waste reduction policies and beyond just single-use plastics, and we're very much open to suggestions, you know, and I routinely hear from residents who give me a call and have different ideas for how to address different pieces of this issue, and we're always looking for those comments and those suggestions. So if the audience has some creative ideas, like please do share, you know, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I know we've only got about 5 minutes left, but one last question that I thought was particularly pertinent and maybe a good opportunity to shine a positive light or put a positive spin on the current situation. We had one audience member named Catherine asked, since we're all currently at home because of COVID-19, how can we continue to change behavior in the public around plastic, as this could be a perfect time for that? And how can we continue to push the envelope with that, given the current circumstances around the world? Any pointers or thoughts on that one?
Well, I'll start with a confession, which is that all of my efforts to get plastic out of the house were immediately rebuffed when I had to bring in a ton more cleaning supplies, like very, very quickly. And I think there's been kind of a push-pull over the last couple of weeks. But, you know, one of the things I find when you're home more and when you're really focused on being efficient in how you live and being much mindful of how you live, right? Everyone is very sort of mindful of what you're using, what you're not using, what's in the pantry, what's not there. It's a really good time to take an extra moment, right? That you don't often have in the hustle and bustle of getting in and out the door every day, to take stock of how you're living. And when you open the pantry doors and you look at the cabinet and you say, all right, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get what I need for the next 2 weeks. This is a really good opportunity for me to try to swap out some of these things, right? So you have to get the peanut butter in the plastic jar. Maybe not, maybe now's the time to go try the one in the glass jar. Do you need to use all the pre-wrapped produce, or will you use some of the recyclable bags? And I will say, even if there's not a zero waste grocery store, and I've struggled to find ones that are entirely zero waste around me, but you find enough that you can kind of make your shop as close to zero waste as possible. I've confounded plenty of grocery store checkout clerk with my little reusable produce bags who are like, what is this? And I'm just ring it up. It's fine. Don't worry about it. But it's a really good time, I think, while we're all being mindful about what's in our homes and how we're living, take one extra beat and just say, what are the things I'm bringing into my home? And is this a good time for me to swap some of these things out? And I also really encourage people to take it easy on themselves, because I think, especially at this time, we have a lot to worry about. We have a lot of things concerning us. And it's one small thing you can add to the list that will have a big impact, but cut yourself some slack.
No, that's a fantastic one. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would just second what Amna was saying. And, if we are all stuck in the confines of our homes, which we mostly are, you can do the room by room approach pretty easily. If you've got some spare time, add that to your list of things that you can do at home right now. The other thing that I just want to mention, since coronavirus was brought up, I don't think we set out in making this documentary, it was never our intention to demonize plastic, because with coronavirus right now, we are seeing how important plastic is in the protective gear that frontline healthcare workers desperately need. And so the point is, as Lillian spoke of so often too, these single-use items that we can get out of our lives, if not entirely, just by reduction. And so, that I think is right now what you could focus on.
I'll just add too, since we are all at home, and everybody on this presentation today has access to the internet. It's a great time to do some online research, right? Get to know a question was asked about recycling and why it's so confusing, right? Like, make sure you are addressing, your recycling correctly in your area. There's also creative alternatives. There's some things we can't recycle, right? Like like chip bags and like snack wrappers and other like plastics that can actually be recycled through TerraCycle, which I believe was mentioned in the documentary. Check if there are TerraCycle bins and you're at any local grocery stores in your area. Try thinking through creatively maybe some of the items that you use that you think should be going in the trash, right? Like maybe there's some creative things you can do with some, you know, arts and crafts projects at home right now. There are some things, you know, that we can kind of, now is absolutely the opportunity for creativity and thinking through, you know, preventing ourselves from using these items in the first place, but also are there alternative alternative places they can go once we've used them, that kind of thing, I think would be a great thing to do right now too.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, Lillian. And another aspect of the question, just in terms of changing behavior, I think you all hit on just fantastic ways that people can continue to address this problem. And one thing I would also recommend is to share these creative, you know, solutions that you're finding in your home. I don't know if anyone else has encountered this, but me personally, it seems like every time I sign on to any form of social media, it's all very, you know, negative. It's empty grocery store aisles. It's bad news, and it's important to stay informed. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity as a community for us to share those learnings of, you know, what we're learning to do at home differently, or if we're learning to, you know, make things differently, where it doesn't need a container, or if you discover a new, you know, recipe for something that you would have previously used in a plastic bottle. And I think the point that was very well taken in terms of being gentle with ourselves. And I think, Lorna, your point that, you know, plastic, it's in and of itself is not an evil substance. You know, it's absolutely critical and transformative for key industries, especially the medical industry right now. But just continue to think about where it's ending up and how it's being used. And I think that you all made that point very well, and I'm sure it's really appreciated from the audience. So we are exactly at 1 hour. I just wanted to take a moment to thank the National Academy of Sciences for hosting this, and to the whole team there for just making this so seamless and for their own problem solving and addressing this. And to the panelists, I really appreciate your time and your creative feedback, and also to the PBS team for completing this documentary. I think it's a really wonderful piece, and I hope that everyone takes the time to watch it, share it with your friends and family. There's just some amazing stories and knowledge in there. So thank you everyone for taking the time. And JD, I don't know if you had any final remarks before we sign off, but I'll hand
I will just I'll say a couple of things and reiterate your gratitude to the panelists and to you, Taylor, for leading such a thoughtful discussion. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the team at the NAS. You imagine just overnight, every meeting that the Academy does is now going online. And this has been a real challenge for them, and they have performed brilliantly. So just to kind of keep that in mind as we do a lot more online things over the next month or so. Always be kind to your AV and meeting people. They are really working hard these days. Again, thank you. Thank you to the people who joined us. I think we had a really good turnout and some amazing questions. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you. Thanks everyone who joined.
Yeah, thank you.